hip bone, hip joint, knee joint, tibia, fibula, lateral malleolus, sacrum, coccyx, femur, patella, medial malleolus, ankle joint, hip bone, ilium, ischium, pubis, sacrum, coccyx, iliac crest, anterior superior iliac spine, pubic symphysis, posterior superior iliac spine, posterior inferior iliac spine, greater sciatic notch, ischial spine, lesser sciatic notch, ischial body, ischial tuberosity, iliac crest, anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine, acetabulum, superior pubic ramus, obturator foramen, inferior pubic ramus, ischial ramus, symphyseal surface, iliac fossa, auricular surface, iliac crest, sacral promontory, arcuate line, pelvic brim, pectineal line, pubic crest, symphysis pubis or public symphysis, pubic arch, arcuate line, neck of femur, greater trochanter, lateral epicondyle, lateral condyle, lesser trochanter, adductor tubercle, medial epicondyle, patellus surface, medial condyle, head of femur, fovea of head of femur, gluteal tuberosity, linea aspera, intercondylar fossa, base, apex, articular surface, lateral condyle, head of fibula, lateral malleolus, medial condyle, tibial tuberosity, tibia, medial malleolus, medial intercondylar tubercle, soleal line, lateral intercondylar tubercle, lateral malleolar fossa, talus, navicular, calcaneus, tarsal bones, medial cuneiform bone, phalanges, metatarsal bones, head of metatarsal bone, head of metatarsal bone, distal phalanx, distal phalanx, middle phalanx, middle phalanx, base of metatarsal bone, base of metatarsal bone, medial cuneiform, medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, cuboid, cuboid, phalanges, phalanges, cuboid, cuboid, navicular, navicular, head of metatarsal bones, head of metatarsal bones, calcaneus, calcaneus, longitudinal arch, longitudinal arch, transverse arch, transverse arch, external iliac artery, external iliac artery, lateral superior genicular artery, lateral superior genicular artery, lateral inferior genicular artery, lateral inferior genicular artery, interior tibial artery, interior tibial artery, interior lateral malleolar artery, interior lateral malleolar artery, lateral tarsal artery, lateral tarsal artery, arcuate artery, arcuate artery, common iliac artery, common iliac artery, internal iliac artery, internal iliac artery, femoral artery, femoral artery, deep femoral artery, deep femoral artery, descending genicular artery, descending genicular artery, medial superior genicular artery, medial superior genicular artery, medial inferior genicular artery, medial inferior genicular artery, posterior tibial artery, posterior tibial artery, interior medial malleolar artery, interior medial malleolar artery, medial malleolar branches, medial malleolar branches, dorsal plantar artery, dorsal plantar artery, fibular artery, fibular artery, external iliac vein, external iliac vein, deep femoral vein, deep femoral vein, interior tibial veins, interior tibial veins, peroneal veins, peroneal veins, femoral vein, femoral vein, great saphenous vein, great saphenous vein, popliteal vein, popliteal vein, posterior tibial vein, posterior tibial vein, small saphenous vein, small saphenous vein, umbilicus, umbilicus, internal oblique abdominal muscle, internal oblique abdominal muscle, iliopsoas muscle, iliopsoas muscle, pubic bone, sartorius muscle, sartorius muscle, subcutaneous fat tissue, subcutaneous fat tissue, rectus abdominis muscle, rectus abdominis muscle, iliac bone, iliac bone, left common femoral vein, left common femoral vein, left common femoral artery, left common femoral artery, pubic symphysis, pubic symphysis, labium majus, labium majus, psoas muscle, psoas muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, urinary bladder, urinary bladder, tensor fasciae lati muscle, tensor fasciae lati muscle, adductor longus muscle, adductor longus muscle, vastus intermedius muscle, vastus intermedius muscle, femoral head, pectineus muscle, pectineus muscle, labium minus, left femoral artery, iliacus muscle, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus medius muscle, obturator internus muscle, obturator internus muscle, obturator externus muscle, obturator externus muscle, vastus lateralis muscle, vastus lateralis muscle, femur shaft, vastus medialis muscle, vastus medialis muscle, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, lumbar vertebra, lumbar vertebra, left common iliac vein, left common iliac vein, acetabulum, acetabulum, greater trochanter, vagina, vagina, adductor brevis muscle, adductor brevis muscle, sacral nerves, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, vagina, vagina, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter, femur shaft, vastus lateralis muscle, iliac bone, sacroiliac joint, uterus, ischium, obturator internus muscle, quadratus femoris muscle, gluteal fold, adductor magnus muscle, longissimus muscle, sacrum, uterine cervix, gluteus maximus muscle, spinous process, piriformis muscle, rectum, anus, subcutaneous fat tissue, natal cleft, coccyx, rectus abdominis muscle, iliac bone, iliopsoas muscle, femoral head, sartorius muscle, rectus femoris muscle, vastus intermedius muscle, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus maximus muscle, gluteus minimus muscle, acetabulum, obturator internus muscle, quadratus femoris muscle, lesser trochanter, biceps femoris muscle, adductor magnus muscle, vastus lateralis muscle, femur shaft, small bowel, external iliac artery, external iliac vein, ilium, pubis, pectineus muscle, adductor minimus muscle, adductor brevis muscle, adductor longus muscle, sacroiliac joint, sacrum, piriformis muscle, obturator externus muscle, ischial tuberosity, ischiarectal fossa, gluteal fold, lumbar, uterine cavity, uterine cervix, urinary bladder, vagina, labium majus, labium minus, spinal canal, uterus, rectum, coccyx, levator ani muscle, anus, psoas psoas muscle, iliacus muscle, iliacus muscle, sacroiliac joint, sacroiliac joint, sacral nerves, rectus abdominis muscle, rectus abdominis muscle, internal oblique abdominal muscle, internal oblique abdominal muscle, iliac bone, gluteus medius muscle, gluteus medius muscle, sacrum, gluteus maximus muscle, gluteus maximus muscle, longissimus muscle, right external iliac vein, right external iliac vein, right external iliac artery, right external iliac artery, gluteus minimus muscle, uterus, piriformis muscle, rectum, iliopsoas muscle, urinary bladder, pubic bone, acetabulum, femoral neck, vagina, greater trochanter, ischium, coccyx, femoral head, rectus femoris muscle, sartorius muscle, tensor fasciae lati muscle, obturator internus muscle, gemellus inferior muscle, pubic symphysis, pectineus muscle, urethra, obturator externus muscle, ischium, obturator internus muscle, levator ani muscle, natal cleft, pubic bone, sartorius muscle, rectus femoris muscle, tensor fasciae lati muscle, gluteus medius muscle, femoral, iliopsoas muscle, quadratus femoris muscle, gluteus maximus muscle, rectum, vagina, mons pubis, adductor brevis muscle, adductor magnus muscle, vagina vestibule, clitoris, vastus intermedius muscle, ischial tuberosity, anal sphincter muscle, quadriceps tendon, infrapatellar fat pad, patellar ligament, vastus lateralis muscle, femur, popliteus muscle, interior cruciate ligament, lateral meniscus, lateral intercondylar tubercle, peroneus longus muscle, extensor digitorum longus muscle, vastus medialis muscle, posterior cruciate ligament, medial collateral ligament, medial meniscus, medial intercondylar tubercle, tibia, tibialis interior muscle, biceps femoris muscle, biceps femoris muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, lateral epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, lateral collateral ligament, lateral collateral ligament, tibiofibular joint, tibiofibular joint, fibula, fibula, sartorius muscle, sartorius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, medial epicondyle, medial epicondyle, tibialis posterior muscle, tibialis posterior muscle, femur, femur, lateral patellar retinaculum, lateral patellar retinaculum, lateral meniscus, lateral meniscus, tibia, tibia, tibialis posterior muscle, tibialis posterior muscle, tibialis interior muscle, tibialis interior muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, lateral meniscus, lateral meniscus, popliteus muscle, popliteus muscle, tibiofibular joint, tibiofibular joint, soleus muscle, soleus muscle, fibula, fibula, quadriceps tendon, quadriceps tendon, patella, patella, patellofemoral joint, patellofemoral joint, femoral cartilage, femoral cartilage, interior cruciate ligament, interior cruciate ligament, infrapatellar fat pad, infrapatellar fat pad, patellar ligament, patellar ligament, semimembranosus muscle, semimembranosus muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, posterior cruciate ligament, posterior cruciate ligament, plantaris muscle, plantaris muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, patellar ligament, patellar ligament, patellofemoral joint, patellofemoral joint, iliotibial tract, iliotibial tract, femur, femur, biceps femoris muscle, biceps femoris muscle, lateral epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, gastrocnemius muscle, gastrocnemius muscle, popliteal artery, popliteal artery, patella, patella, retropatellar cartilage, retropatellar cartilage, joint fluid, intercondyloid fossa, intercondyloid fossa, medial epicondyle, medial epicondyle, sartorius muscle, sartorius muscle, interior cruciate ligament, interior cruciate ligament, lateral collateral ligament, lateral collateral ligament, plantaris muscle, plantaris muscle, medial collateral ligament, medial collateral ligament, posterior cruciate ligament, posterior cruciate ligament, interosseous membrane of leg, interosseous membrane of leg, fibula, fibula, soleus muscle, soleus muscle, tibia, tibia, popliteus muscle, popliteus muscle, tibia, tibia, tendon of tibialis interior, tendon of tibialis interior, talatibial joint, talatibial joint, navicular, navicular, cuneiform, cuneiform, metatarsal bone, metatarsal bone, cuneiform, cuneiform, cuboid, cuboid, metatarsal bone, metatarsal bone, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, soleus muscle, soleus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, talus, talus, Achilles tendon, Achilles tendon, posterior subtalar joint, posterior subtalar joint, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, calcaneus, calcaneus, abductor digiti minimi muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, plantar aponeurosis, plantar aponeurosis, flexor digitorum brevis muscle, flexor digitorum brevis muscle, great saphenous vein, great saphenous vein, tibia, tibia, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, deltoid ligament, deltoid ligament, tibialis posterior muscle, tibialis posterior muscle, flexor digitorum longus muscle, flexor digitorum longus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, abductor hallucis muscle, abductor hallucis muscle, quadratus plantae muscle, quadratus plantae muscle, flexor digitorum brevis muscle, flexor digitorum brevis muscle, calcaneus, calcaneus, interior inferior tibiofibular ligament, interior inferior tibiofibular ligament, talitibial joint, talitibial joint, talus, talus, interior talofibular ligament, interior talofibular ligament, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, peroneus brevis muscle, peroneus brevis muscle, peroneus longus muscle, peroneus longus muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, plantar aponeurosis, plantar aponeurosis, posterior subtalar joint, posterior subtalar joint, posterior tibiofibular ligament, posterior tibiofibular ligament, fibula, fibula, posterior talofibular ligament, posterior talofibular ligament, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, Achilles tendon, Achilles tendon, extensor digitorum longus muscle, extensor digitorum longus muscle, talus, talus, talofibular joint, talofibular joint, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, posterior talofibular ligament, posterior talofibular ligament, peroneus longus muscle, peroneus longus muscle, posterior tibiofibular ligament, posterior tibiofibular ligament, flexor hallucis longus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, tibialis interior muscle, tibialis interior muscle, deltoid ligament, deltoid ligament, talitibial joint, talitibial joint, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, tibialis posterior muscle, tibialis posterior muscle, flexor digitorum longus muscle, flexor digitorum longus muscle, Achilles tendon, Achilles tendon, navicular, navicular, dorsal talonavicular ligament, dorsal talonavicular ligament, extensor digitorum brevis muscle, extensor digitorum brevis muscle, interior talofibular ligament, interior talofibular ligament, talonavicular joint, talonavicular joint, intermediate cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, calcaneus, calcaneus, metatarsalphalangeal joint, metatarsalphalangeal joint, metatarsal bone, metatarsal bone, medial cuneiform, medial cuneiform, cuneonavicular joint, cuneonavicular joint, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, metatarsal bone, metatarsal bone, interossei muscles, interossei muscles, abductor digiti minimi muscle, abductor digiti minimi muscle, distal phalanx, distal phalanx, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, metatarsalphalangeal joint, metatarsalphalangeal joint, abductor hallucis muscle, abductor hallucis muscle, flexor hallucis brevis muscle, flexor hallucis brevis muscle, flexor digitorum brevis muscle, flexor digitorum brevis muscle, plantar aponeurosis, plantar aponeurosis, calcaneal tuberosity, calcaneal tuberosity, talus, talus, talonavicular joint, talonavicular joint, navicular, navicular, cuneiform, cuneiform, cuboid, cuboid, metatarsal bone, metatarsal bone, intermediate phalanx, intermediate phalanx, distal phalanx, distal phalanx, proximal phalanx, proximal phalanx, soleus muscle, soleus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, flexor hallucis longus muscle, tibia, tibia, talatibial joint, talatibial joint, Achilles tendon, Achilles tendon, posterior subtalar joint, posterior subtalar joint, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, calcaneus, calcaneus, quadratus plantae muscle, quadratus plantae muscle, cuneiform, cuneiform, extensor digitorum brevis muscle, extensor digitorum brevis muscle, cuneiform, cuneiform, metatarsal bone, metatarsal bone, tibialis interior muscle, tibialis interior muscle, great saphenous vein, great saphenous vein, transverse process, transverse process, ilium, ilium, sacrum, sacrum, interior superior iliac spine, interior superior iliac spine, interior inferior iliac spine, interior inferior iliac spine, neck of femur, greater trochanter, hep joint, ischium, femur shaft, L-spine, sacroiliac joint, coccyx, head of femur, pubic bone, obturator foramen, lesser trochanter, pubic symphysis, spinous process, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter, femur shaft, head of femur, neck of femur, ilium, pubic bone, pubic symphysis, hep joint, head of femur, acetabulum, greater trochanter, femur shaft, interior inferior iliac spine, neck of femur, ischium, ilium, hep joint, greater trochanter, femur shaft, interior inferior iliac spine, head of femur, ischium, lesser trochanter, sacroiliac joint, sacrum, coccyx, sacral foramen, ilium, interior superior iliac spine, hep joint, neck of femur, femur shaft, head of femur, lesser trochanter, L-spine, pubic bone, sacrum, ischium, pubic, spinous process, spinal canal, coccyx, ilium, sacroiliac joint, sacral foramen, sacral foramen, sacrum, sacrum, spinal canal, spinal canal, acetabulum, acetabulum, neck of femur, greater trochanter, greater trochanter, coccyx, coccyx, pubic bone, head of femur, ischium, ischium, pubic bone, neck of femur, greater trochanter, ischium, femur shaft, pubic symphysis, lesser trochanter, neck of femur, greater trochanter, shaft of femur, lateral epicondyle, head of femur, lesser trochanter, medial epicondyle, intercondyloid fossa, epicondyle, anterior inferior iliac spine, head of femur, greater trochanter, shaft of femur, lateral intercondylar tubercle, lateral epicondyle, lateral condyle, tibia, hip joint, neck of femur, ischium, medial intercondylar tubercle, medial epicondyle, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, patellofemoral joint, epicondyle, shaft of femur, medial epicondyle, patella, medial condyle, medial intercondylar tubercle, tibia, lateral epicondyle, lateral intercondylar tubercle, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, lateral condyle, head of fibula, tibiofibular joint, fibula, patellofemoral joint, lateral condyle, intercondyloid fossa, shaft of femur, medial epicondyle, medial intercondylar tubercle, medial condyle, tibia, lateral epicondyle, intercondyloid fossa, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, lateral condyle, patellofemoral joint, patella, shaft of femur, patellofemoral joint, medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle, intercondyloid fossa, tibia, tibiofibular joint, fibula, patella, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, tibia, talatibial joint, medial malleolus, talus, talus, femur, femur, proximal tibiofibular joint, proximal tibiofibular joint, fibula, fibula, distal tibiofibular joint, distal tibiofibular joint, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, talofibular joint, talofibular joint, lateral condyle, lateral condyle, calcaneus, calcaneus, intercondyloid fossa, intercondyloid fossa, femur, femur, tibiofemoral joint, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, knee joint, tibia, tibia, talotibial joint, talotibial joint, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, talus, talus, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, intercondylar tubercle, intercondylar tubercle, distal tibiofibular joint, distal tibiofibular joint, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, talofibular joint, talofibular joint, subtalar joint, subtalar joint, medial condyle, medial condyle, intercondyloid fossa, intercondyloid fossa, calcaneus, calcaneus, lateral condyle, lateral condyle, proximal tibiofibular joint, proximal tibiofibular joint, fibula, fibula, patella, patella, patellofemoral joint, patellofemoral joint, talotibial joint, talotibial joint, talus, talus, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, femur, femur, tibiofemoral joint, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, knee joint, posterior subtalar joint, posterior subtalar joint, calcaneus, calcaneus, tibia, tibia, fibula, fibula, proximal tibiofibular joint, proximal tibiofibular joint, tibia, tibia, talotibial joint, talotibial joint, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, talus, talus, talonavicular joint, talonavicular joint, navicular, navicular, medial cuneiform, medial cuneiform, fibula, fibula, distal tibiofibular joint, distal tibiofibular joint, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, talofibular joint, talofibular joint, subtalar joint, subtalar joint, calcaneus, calcaneus, intermediate cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, cuboid, cuboid, lateral cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, metatarsals, metatarsals, posterior subtalar joint, posterior subtalar joint, metatarsal joint, metatarsal joint, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, medial cuneiform, medial cuneiform, tibia, tibia, talotibial joint, talotibial joint, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, talus, talus, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, fibula, fibula, distal tibiofibular joint, distal tibiofibular joint, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, talofibular joint, talofibular joint, subtalar joint, subtalar joint, calcaneus, calcaneus, navicular, navicular, cuneonavicular joint, cuneonavicular joint, cuneiform, cuneiform, talonavicular joint, talonavicular joint, metatarsals, metatarsals, posterior subtalar joint, posterior subtalar joint, metatarsal joint, metatarsal joint, cuboid, cuboid, tibia, tibia, distal tibiofibular joint, distal tibiofibular joint, fibula, fibula, talotibial joint, talotibial joint, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, talus, talus, talofibular joint, talofibular joint, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, navicular, navicular, calcaneus, calcaneus, talonavicular joint, talonavicular joint, tarsal sinus, tarsal sinus, subtalar joint, subtalar joint, medial cuneiform, medial cuneiform, cuneonavicular joint, cuneonavicular joint, intermediate cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, cuboid, cuboid, metatarsal joint, metatarsal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, intermediate phalanges, intermediate phalanges, lateral cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, cuboid, cuboid, metatarsal joint, metatarsal joint, calcaneus, calcaneus, lateral malleolus, lateral malleolus, distal tibiofibular joint, distal tibiofibular joint, distal phalanges, distal phalanges, distal interphalangeal joint, distal interphalangeal joint, proximal phalanges, proximal phalanges, metatarsophalangeal joint, metatarsophalangeal joint, metatarsals, metatarsals, medial cuneiform, medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, cuneonavicular joint, cuneonavicular joint, navicular, navicular, talonavicular joint, talonavicular joint, medial malleolus, medial malleolus, talus, talus, tibia, tibia, distal phalanges, distal phalanges, proximal phalanges, proximal phalanges, sesamoid bones, sesamoid bones, subtalar joint, subtalar joint, talotibial joint, talotibial joint, external iliac artery, external iliac artery, superior gluteal artery, superior gluteal artery, inferior gluteal artery, inferior gluteal artery, obturator artery, obturator artery, deep femoral artery, deep femoral artery, femoral artery, femoral artery, internal iliac artery, internal iliac artery, common femoral artery, common femoral artery, lateral femoral circumflex artery, lateral femoral circumflex artery, catheter, catheter, popliteal artery, popliteal artery, femoral artery, femoral artery, popliteal artery, popliteal artery, interior tibial artery, interior tibial artery, tibioperoneal trunk, tibioperoneal trunk, peroneal artery, peroneal artery, posterior tibial artery, posterior tibial artery, dorsalis pedis artery, dorsalis pedis artery, plantar artery, plantar artery, spinous process, spinous process, transverse process, transverse process, ilium, ilium, sacrum, sacrum, interior superior iliac spine, interior superior iliac spine, interior inferior iliac spine, interior inferior iliac spine, hep joint, hep joint, greater trochanter, greater trochanter, obturator foramen, obturator foramen, lesser trochanter, lesser trochanter, pubic bone, pubic bone, shaft of femur, shaft of femur, sacroiliac joint, sacroiliac joint, coccyx, coccyx, head of femur, head of femur, neck of femur, neck of femur, ischium, ischium, pubic symphysis, pubic symphysis, epiphyseal joint, epiphyseal joint, superior articular process, superior articular process, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, ilium, ilium, interior superior iliac spine, interior superior iliac spine, interior inferior iliac spine, interior inferior iliac spine, hip joint, greater trochanter, pubic bone, obturator foramen, lesser trochanter, shaft of femur, sacroiliac joint, sacrum, head of femur, coccyx, neck of femur, pubic symphysis, ischium, pubic bone, hip joint, neck of femur, greater trochanter, shaft of femur, patella, lateral condyle, pubic symphysis, obturator foramen, head of femur, ischium, lesser trochanter, medial condyle, femur condyle, tibia, fibula, shaft of femur, lateral epicondyle, lateral condyle, lateral intercondylar tubercle, tibiofibular joint, fibula, patella, medial condyle, medial epicondyle, medial intercondylar tubercle, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, medial condyle, tibia, patellofemoral joint, femur condyle, patellofemoral joint, femur, medial intercondylar tubercle, lateral intercondylar tubercle, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, lateral condyle, proximal tibiofibular joint, fibula, distal tibiofibular joint, lateral malleolus, medial condyle, tibia, medial malleolus, talitibial joint, talus, talofibular joint, posterior subtalar joint, calcaneus, fibula, distal tibiofibular joint, lateral malleolus, talofibular joint, cuboid, lateral cuneiform, tibia, talitibial joint, medial malleolus, talus, subtalar joint, talonavicular joint, navicular, intermediate cuneiform, medial cuneiform, first metatarsal, tarsal sinus, cuneo-navicular joint, cuneiform, posterior subtalar joint, calcaneus, mid-tarsal joint, distal interphalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, metatarsophalangeal joint, sesamoid bones, medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, cuneo-navicular joint, navicular, talonavicular joint, talus, medial malleolus, talotibial joint, tibia, distal phalanges, intermediate phalanges, proximal phalanges, metatarsals, cuboid, mid-tarsal joint, calcaneus, talofibular joint, lateral malleolus, distal tibiofibular joint, fibula, tarsal sinus, posterior subtalar joint, cuneiform, pelvis, sacroiliac joint, hip joint, femur, patella, tibiofemoral joint, knee joint, tibia, fibula, ankle joint, foot, sacrum, gonadal shield, epiphyseal line,